Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the 5 worst trades in modern Sharks history as opposed to the 5 best trades that I did in my previous video. Now, unlike in the best trades where there were these franchise-altering deals of picking up names like Thornton and Burns and Boyle, there's nothing terrible in the Sharks history. I don't think any of these trades you sort of even compare to some of their best counterparts. Most of them on this list are basically in which the Sharks acquired a certain player, let's say at the deadline, and ended up trading away a higher draft pick who ended up becoming a solid player. So 5th on this list, before I get to that, I guess a few honorable mentions, small ones like trading a 2nd round pick for Nicholas Wallin or trading Nick Bonino amongst other players for Travis Moen and Kent Huskins. And then, of course, the usual Erik Karlsson trade. This was one I mentioned as a possible best trade, and it also must be mentioned as a possible bad trade. I mean, currently it's trending more towards the bad side. Dylan DeMello, while not still with the Ottawa Senators, is still a pretty decent defenseman in the NHL. Chris Tierney, a solid third-line center. Josh Norris is looking like he's panning out as a pretty effective prospect. The Sharks just traded 3rd overall pick in this trade as well. And so, while I can't put it on this list just yet, because we don't know how Erik Karlsson's going to look over the next couple of years with the Sharks, it is one that's dangerously close to being on this. But in the end, at 5th, I put the Jamie McKinnon trade. The Sharks trading away Jamie McKinnon as well as prospects Mike Connolly and Michael Scarbosa in exchange for TJ Gagliardi, Daniel Winnick, and a 7th rounder. And the reason I have this on this list is because I remember at the moment this trade was made, I heavily disliked it, and I don't think it actually made the Sharks better at the time. Usually these rental trades are viewed as poor, that even though they make the team better for the moment, it is too much of a mortgage of the future. But personally, I don't even think the team was made better by the trade in that specific moment. I actually had some decent hopes for McKinnon. I knew he wasn't going to end up being like a 60-point player, but he seemed like probably the best player traded in this deal, which is why I really didn't like that the Sharks made it. Daniel Winnick didn't end up doing anything with the Sharks and immediately left during the offseason. Gagliardi at the very least stayed for an extra season, but still. And while McKinnon never really ended up hitting that potential, who knows what he could have done with the Sharks had he remained there. The next trade on this list is the Brian Campbell deal. This is a rental trade at the deadline. And it's always kind of difficult to evaluate how you actually view a rental trade. Is a rental trade always a failure unless your team actually ends up going on to win the Stanley Cup that year? Would we say that the Sharks trading away a 2nd and 3rd round pick to pick up Gustav Nyquist and then losing in the Western Conference Finals makes the Nyquist trade a bad deal? Would we say picking up Roman Polak, James Reimer, and Nick Spaulding at the deadline in 2016, but then losing in the Stanley Cup Finals to the Pittsburgh Penguins made those deals a bad trade? It's kind of hard to say. So this Brian Campbell one, in the end, because the Sharks gave up so many resources to actually acquire him and were unable to keep him during the offseason, he ended up going to sign with the Blackhawks. Because of all those factors, it does end up on this list. The Sharks traded away Steve Bernier, who didn't end up being an effective forward anyway. But the big one was trading away the 1st round pick that ended up becoming Tyler Ennis to the Buffalo Sabres. And I've always been a pretty big Tyler Ennis fan. Of course, in these past few seasons, he hasn't really gotten to do much, although he did have a decent year with the Ottawa Senators. But I felt as though a lot of the time where he would be expected to develop was spent with a really, really bad Buffalo Sabres team. So, in a parallel universe where the Sharks don't pick up Brian Campbell, retain this 1st round pick, and end up picking Tyler Ennis, maybe Ennis on a good Sharks team ends up becoming a solid player. So the Campbell trade didn't really help the San Jose Sharks, and they gave up some pretty good assets to do it. The 3rd trade on this list is the Sharks ended up picking, I guess I should say the Sharks ended up trading Christian Ehrhoff as well as Brad Lukowich and ended up getting Daniel Rahimi as well as Patrick White. This was more so, the reason this trade isn't higher up, considering the fact that Christian Ehrhoff was an effective defenseman at this point and none of the other players in this trade ended up doing anything at the NHL level. The only reason it's not higher up on this list is because this was technically a deal that the Sharks needed to make to clear up cap space to eventually acquire Danny Heatley a couple of weeks later. So it's hard to view it so horribly, but it feels as though there must have been some better options out there for when trading away Christian Ehrhoff. I do know that these 2 players that the Sharks did acquire were high round picks of even that year. I believe Patrick White was the Vancouver Canucks 1st rounder, a late 1st rounder at that, but still a late 1st rounder. And so maybe the Sharks were expecting him to become something, but just in the end, it felt as though the Sharks just did a cap dump here that ended up just not giving them anything besides the cap room. The second trade on this list is one of which the Sharks picked up Craig Rive and a 5th rounder in exchange for Josh Georges and a 1st rounder, which ended up becoming Max Pacioretty. This one was going to be first on this list, but considering the fact that Craig Rive did at the very least stick around an extra season after this, I ended up putting it second, but this ended up being a very bad deal. Josh Georges would not only become a pretty decent defenseman for the Canadiens for many years after this deal was made. Of course, the 1st round pick acquiring Max Pacioretty is one that the Sharks regret not having kept and being able to use themselves. It's just Craig Rive never really did much of anything with the Sharks. He was decent with them for about a year and a half, but nothing more than that, and the Sharks absolutely would have rathered have Josh Georges and the 1st round pick that definitely could have become Max Pacioretty if they drafted the same way. And finally, at the top of this list, the Sharks getting Bill Garen at the deadline in exchange for Jay Barable, Ville Nieminen, and of course a 1st rounder, which would end up becoming David Perron. So this one finds its way at the top of the list above the Craig Rive trade. Why? Because Garen was there for basically the rest of the regular season, and then once the Sharks were eliminated in the playoffs, Garen immediately left the team. This ended up being a rental, and just sort of rental bar end. He didn't perform particularly well with the Sharks even in his time here, unlike Brian Campbell, who I thought did quite well with the Sharks while he was on the team, even if that was also simply a rental in that situation. And of course, the fact that the Sharks ended up trading away this 1st rounder that would become a pretty effective forward like David Perron ends up making this trade look quite bad. But in the end, as I said, none of these trades are necessarily terrible. I don't think the Sharks, really disastrously lost and heavily affected the future of this franchise because of any of these trades. But still, there are a few black marks, I guess, on the all-around rather successful resume of Doug Wilson. Class dismissed.